The sound that stopped the entire street wasn't the siren. It was the click. Metal on metal. A safety disengaged. A police officer stood in the middle of the road, legs wide, jaw tight, gun raised, aimed straight at a man who hadn't moved an inch. "In hands up now!" People froze. Cars idled. Samanon dropped a coffee cup. Because the man facing the gun wasn't running, wasn't shouting, wasn't arguing. He stood perfectly still, calm, centered, like the moment meant nothing to him. That man was Steven Seagal. At first, no one said his name out loud. They just stared, trying to connect the face to the moment. The black jacket, the quiet eyes. The strange stillness that didn't match the tension in the air. Phones began to rise. "This can't be real," someone whispered. "Is that him?" Another asked. The officer didn't care. "Don't test me," he barked, finger tightening. "I said don't move." Steven slowly lifted his hands, palms open. No sudden motion, no defiance, just control. "Officer," he said evenly, "there's no threat here." That should have been the end of it. But the officer took a step closer. People gasped. The gun didn't lower. It steadied. And that's when the mood shifted, not into chaos, but into something worse. Silence. The kind of silence where everyone knows something has gone wrong, but no one knows how bad it's about to get. A woman across the street whispered, "Why is he so calm?" A man near the curb shook his head. "Because he knows something we don't." Steven's eyes never left the officer's. "No sudden movements," the cop warned. "You fit the description." "What description?" Steven asked calmly. The officer didn't answer. He adjusted his stance wrong. His grip tightened, worse. The tremor in the hand holding the weapon. And for the first time, his voice changed, not louder, not sharper, but heavier. "Officer," he said quietly, "you're making a serious mistake." That was the moment the crowd understood this wasn't about a misunderstanding anymore. This was about power and control, and what happens when the wrong person pulls a gun on the wrong man, because 5 minutes later, that weapon wouldn't be the headline. The handcuffs would be. The officer hadn't arrived calm. That much was obvious. The patrol car was still angled halfway into the street, engine running, driver's door wide open like he'd jumped out before it even stopped rolling. One hand hovered near his radio, the other locked tight around the grip of his weapon. His breathing was shallow, fast. Steven noticed that too. Around them, the world hesitated. A delivery truck sat frozen at the curb. A cyclist balanced awkwardly with one foot on the ground. A couple standing outside a cafe had stopped mid-sentence, their words swallowed by the tension hanging in the air. This wasn't a dramatic movie moment. This was real. "Turn around," the officer ordered. Slowly. Steven didn't move yet. Not because he was resisting, but because he was calculating. Distance, angles. The officer's posture. The fact that his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Officer," Steven said, still calm, still measured. "Before this goes any further, let's take a breath. Do not tell me how to do my job," the cop snapped. His gun wavered for just a second. Steven raised his hands a little higher and slowly turned his body sideways, making himself less of a target. A subtle move, a trained move. That didn't go unnoticed. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You law enforcement?" he asked sharply. "I train law enforcement," Steven replied, "among others." That answer didn't land the way it should have. Instead of easing the tension, it made the officer bristle. "Yeah, funny. Because we've got a report of a suspicious male leaving a restricted facility." Steven glanced behind him, the low-profile building he'd just exited. No signage, no flashing lights, just a nondescript structure most people passed without a second look. "This isn't restricted," Steven said. "And I have clearance. Save it." The officer shot back. "Everyone's got a story." The crowd had grown. People edged closer, drawn by the same instinct that makes drivers slow down at accidents. Phones were fully out now, some recording openly, others pretending to text while angling their cameras just right. A low murmur spread. "That really looks like him. I swear that's Steven Seagal. No way a cop pulls a gun on him like that." The officer heard it, and that made things worse. "You," he barked at the crowd. Back up, all of you. No one moved far. They just took half steps, unwilling to leave but afraid to stay too close. Steven's voice cut through the noise, steady and clear. Officer, I'm not armed. I'm not resisting. And your weapon doesn't need to be out. The officer laughed. A short, sharp sound with no humor in it. Funny how everyone suddenly becomes a procedure expert when they're staring down a barrel. Steven didn't flinch. That's not what this is, he said. This is escalation. The word hung there. Escalation, a term every officer knows. A term drilled into training manuals, repeated in briefings, written into policy. The officer shifted his feet again. His stance was still off. Weight too far forward, knees locked. Steven noticed a bead of sweat slide down the officer's temple. You're very calm for someone being detained, the cop said. Steven met his eyes. Calm keeps people alive. For a split second, the officer hesitated, then his radio crackled. Unit 27, status check. The officer didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. On a stop, he finally said, possible suspect. Steven spoke again, slower now. Call it in properly. Say where you are. Say who I am. The officer scoffed. You think your name matters? It does, Steven said. But not for the reason you think. That answer confused him. Confusion turned into irritation. Irritation edged dangerously close to panic. Turn around. The officer repeated, louder this time. Hands on your head. Steven complied. Slowly, deliberately. Every movement exaggerated so there could be no misunderstanding. As his hands touched the back of his head, he spoke without turning. There are cameras on this street, he said, and your body cam is running. The officer froze. How do you know that? A siren wailed faintly in the distance, not rushing, not urgent, but coming closer all the same. The officer swallowed. What's your name? He asked. Steven paused, then said it clearly. Steven Seagal. The officer blinked once twice. That's not funny, he said. It's not a joke, Steven replied. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Oh my God, he said his name. That is him. The officer shook his head hard, like he could physically shake the moment away. Doesn't change anything, he said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction now. Turn around. Steven stayed exactly where he was. Officer, he said, calm as ever, in about 5 minutes, this situation is going to look very different. The officer tightened his grip on the gun. We'll see about that. And that was the moment, the exact moment, when the balance of power quietly began to shift, because help wasn't coming for the man with the gun. It was coming because of him. The officer's finger hovered just a little closer to the trigger. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it was enough. Steven saw it immediately. Around them, the crowd sensed the shift too. That subtle moment when a situation crosses an invisible line, when fear stops being abstract and becomes physical. A man near the cafe quietly pulled his daughter behind him. Someone else whispered, "This is going bad." The officer cleared his throat. "Last warning," he said. "Turn around." Now, Steven remained still. Not defiant, not challenging, just still. "Officer," he said calmly, "your heart rate is up, your breathing is shallow, and you're reacting, not assessing." "What did you say?" The cop snapped. "You're under stress," Steven continued. "And stressed officers make mistakes." The officer took another step forward, too close. "Don't psychoanalyze me," he barked. "You don't know anything about me." Steven nodded slightly. "I know enough." That answer landed wrong. The officer's voice rose. "You think you're smarter than me?" "No," Steven said. "I think you're overwhelmed." That did it. "On the ground," the officer shouted. "Now." The crowd gasped. Steven slowly lowered one knee, then paused deliberately. He looked up, eyes steady. "Before I do that," he said, "you need to listen carefully." The officer's jaw clenched. "You don't give orders here." "I'm not giving an order," Steven replied. "I'm giving you a chance." "A chance for what?" the cop demanded. "To stop this before it becomes something you can't undo." Silence followed, the kind that presses against the ears. The officer hesitated, just a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation doubt crept in. What facility did you come out of? He asked abruptly. A private training center, Steven answered. For who? For professionals? That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm allowed to give. The officer scoffed. Convenient. Steven finally lowered himself fully to the ground, hands visible, movements slow and precise. He positioned his body at an angle that reduced risk, something only trained people do, the officer noticed. Where did you learn to do that? He asked, suspicion replacing anger. Steven didn't look at him. From watching situations like this go wrong, he said. The officer approached, gun still drawn, circling cautiously. His movements were rigid. His shadow stretched long across the pavement. You ever been arrested? The cop asked. Yes, Steven said. That stopped him. The officer blinked. For what? Standing up, Steven replied, and sitting down depends on the year. A few people in the crowd let out nervous laughs. The officer shot them a glare, and the laughter died instantly. Hands behind your back, he ordered. Steven complied. As the officer reached for his cuffs, Steven spoke again, quietly, but clearly. You're being recorded by at least 12 phones, he said. And your body cam, and the security cameras on that building. The officer's hand froze midair. How do you know how many? He asked. Steven didn't answer. The officer snapped the cuffs on anyway, too tight. Too fast. Steven winced, just slightly. That's unnecessary, he said. You'll live, the cop replied, trying to sound firm, but his confidence was slipping. The radio crackled again. Unit 27, confirm status. The officer pressed the button. One male detained, still checking. What's the name? The voice asked. The officer hesitated. Steven spoke up, loud enough for the radio to catch. Steven Seagal. There it was. Out in the open, the officer's eyes widened. The radio went silent for a beat, then came back sharper, faster. Repeat the name? The officer swallowed. He says his name is Steven Seagal. Another pause, longer this time. Stand by, the dispatcher said. The crowd erupted in whispers. Oh my God. They're checking him. This is serious. The officer stepped back, suddenly unsure of where to stand, his gun lowered slightly, not holstered, but no longer aimed. Steven remained calm, seated on the pavement like he was waiting for a bus, not surrounded by tension. You could still uncuff me, Steven said gently, before supervisors arrive. The officer bristled. You threatening me? No, Steven said. I'm advising you. Sirens grew louder now, 2 of them, approaching fast. The officer's face flushed. He looked at the cuffs, at the phones, at the crowd. At Steven, still calm, still composed, still in control without trying to be. You planned this, the officer accused. Steven shook his head. No, he said. You did. The first supervisor vehicle screeched to a stop. Then another doors opened, boots hit pavement. A senior officer took one look at the scene. The crowd, the cameras, the man in cuffs on the ground, and his expression hardened. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. The officer opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the supervisor looked down at Steven. And his tone changed completely. Sir. The supervisor didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Officer, he said evenly. Step away from the scene. The words hit harder than a shout. The officer looked around, stunned, as if expecting someone, anyone, to jump in and say this was all a misunderstanding. But no one moved. Not the crowd. Not the other officers. Not even his partner, who stood stiffly near the patrol car, eyes fixed straight ahead. This is ridiculous, the officer muttered. I was doing my job. The supervisor met his gaze. Then you won't mind an investigation. That was when the officer's hands began to shake. Not from anger now, from fear. A second. Patrol car rolled up slowly. Lights on but siren silent. The kind of arrival that didn't escalate, but finalized. 2 internal affairs officers stepped out. Badges clipped, faces unreadable. The crowd murmured. Internal affairs. He's done. Steven watched quietly from the curb, hands resting loosely on his knees. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't look angry. He looked focused. The senior supervisor turned to him again. "Sir," he said, "we'll need a statement. You're not required to give one now, but—" "I will," Steven replied. That surprised him. "Now?" the supervisor asked. "Yes," Steven said, "while everything is fresh, and while everyone's watching." The officer scoffed weakly. "Of course you will." Steven stood slowly and faced him for the first time since the cuffs came off. "I'm not doing this to you," Steven said calmly. "I'm doing this for the next person." The words landed like a weight. One of the internal affairs officers stepped forward. "Officer, please turn around." "What?" the officer snapped. "I'm not under arrest." "Not yet," the agent replied. "But you are being detained pending review of excessive force, procedural violations, and false reporting." The officer laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "This is because he's famous," he said, pointing at Steven. "That's it. If this was anyone else," Steven interrupted, voice steady. "If this were anyone else," he said, "they might not be standing here right now." Silence. No one argued. The body cam footage was already being reviewed on a tablet. A supervisor scrolled, stopped, rewound. The moment the gun came out too early, the commands that contradicted each other, the failure to identify a threat before escalating, every mistake captured from multiple angles. The internal affairs officer nodded once. "Turn around," he said again. This time, the officer hesitated, then slowly complied. When the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound echoed louder than before. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Wow, it really happened." Another voice replied, "He did that to himself." The officer looked over his shoulder at Steven, eyes burning. "You think you're teaching a lesson," he said. "You're just ruining a career." Steven met his gaze, calm as ever. "No," he said. "Your choices did that." The officer was guided toward the second patrol car. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Cameras followed him. Phones stayed raised. There was no escaping the moment. Before the door closed, he spoke again, quieter now. "This isn't over," he said. Steven nodded once. "You're right," he replied. "It isn't." The door shut. The supervisor exhaled deeply and turned back to Steven. "Sir," he said, "on behalf of the department, I apologize." Steven studied him for a moment. "Apologies matter," he said, "but training matters more." The supervisor nodded, agreed. Steven gestured subtly toward the crowd. They saw everything. That's accountability. A man near the cafe called out, "Thank you for staying calm." Others nodded in agreement. Steven didn't address them directly. Instead, he looked at the younger officers standing nearby, watching, absorbing, learning. "Remember this," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry. "A badge doesn't make you powerful, your discipline does." The supervisor extended a hand. Steven shook it. As he turned to leave, someone finally said it out loud. That was Steven Seagal, and he didn't even raise his voice. Steven paused at the edge of the sidewalk and glanced back once. "The goal," he said, "is to go home alive, for everyone." Then he walked away. No escort, no applause, no victory pose. Just a quiet street, a shaken crowd, and one undeniable truth left behind. Power doesn't come from pulling a weapon. It comes from knowing when not to. And that lesson, captured on cameras, burned into memory, would follow that officer far longer than any siren ever could. The street didn't return to normal right away. Even after the patrol cars pulled off, one carrying the officer in the back seat, another trailing close behind. People stayed where they were, like they needed a moment to recalibrate, like reality had tilted and hadn't fully settled back into place. Steven walked a few steps, then stopped. The supervisor noticed and approached again, slower this time, more careful. "Sir," he said, "is there anything else you need before you go?" Steven looked around, at the cafe, the training facility behind him, the cluster of people still holding phones, unsure whether to stop recording or keep going. "Yes," Steven said. "There is." The supervisor straightened. "Of course." Steven gestured toward a young man standing near the curb, early 20s, hoodie, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. He had been there from the beginning, hadn't said a word, hadn't moved when the gun came out. "Can you bring him over here?" Steven asked. The supervisor hesitated, then nodded. "You, come here." The young man blinked. "Me? Yes," the supervisor said. "You." He walked over slowly, eyes darting between Steven and the officers. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. Steven smiled faintly. "Number? You're a witness." The young man swallowed. "I didn't do anything." "I know," Steven said. "That's why I want you here." The supervisor looked confused. "Sir." Steven turned to him. "When your officer drew his weapon, this man was directly behind me, within 10 feet. The supervisor glanced at the young man, then back at Steven. And when a firearm comes out without cause," Steven said calmly, "everyone in range is at risk, not just the person it's aimed at." The young man's eyes widened. "Wait, you could have been hurt today, for no reason." The supervisor's expression tightened. "That's why this matters," Steven continued. "Not because I was involved, but because next time it might be someone like him, without cameras, without supervisors, without a crowd." The young man looked down at his hands. "I didn't even know what to do," he admitted. "I just froze." "That's normal," Steven said. "Freezing isn't weakness. It's human." The supervisor exhaled slowly. "I understand." Steven turned back to the young man. "You're okay to go. But remember this feeling, and remember that you have the right to be treated with respect." The young man nodded quickly. "Thank you, sir." As he walked away, the crowd shifted again. The moment had become something more than spectacle now. It had become a lesson. A few officers lingered nearby. Younger ones, newer faces. They weren't checking radios or directing traffic anymore. They were listening, Steven noticed. He addressed them without ceremony. "Most situations don't need force," he said. "They need patience, awareness, ego control." One of the officers spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, what should he have done differently?" Steven considered him for a moment. "First," he said, "slow down. Second, identify the threat before you react. Third, remember that authority doesn't replace judgment." The officer nodded, absorbing every word. The supervisor checked his watch. "Internal review will begin immediately," he said. "Bodycam footage, witness statements, everything." Steven nodded. "That's how it should be." A woman from the cafe approached cautiously. "Excuse me," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you for not making it worse." Steven smiled politely. "Making it worse is easy. Making it better takes work." She laughed softly. "I'm going to remember that." One by one, people began to leave. The tension drained away, replaced by quiet conversation, by reflection, by disbelief. Steven finally turned back toward the training facility. The supervisor walked with him partway. "I won't pretend this will be easy," the supervisor said. "There'll be paperwork, media, politics." Steven stopped and looked at him. "Do the right thing anyway," he said, "even when it's inconvenient." The supervisor nodded once. "We will." They shook hands again, firmer this time. Steven reached the door of the building and paused, hand on the handle. He looked back at the street one last time, the place where a gun had been drawn, where fear had spiked, where restraint had changed the outcome. He spoke quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Everyone went home today. The door closed behind him. Familiar. Outside, the echoes of the incident would continue, in reports, in meetings, in training sessions yet to come. And somewhere down the line, because of what happened here, an officer might pause before drawing a weapon, might take a breath, might choose discipline over impulse. That was the real outcome. Not the arrest, not the headlines, not the videos, but the possibility that the next encounter, unseen, unrecorded, would end the same way this one did, with everyone still standing. The videos didn't go viral immediately. At first, they moved quietly, passed from phone to phone, uploaded with shaky captions, shared in group chats with messages like, "Did you see this? And this could have gone so wrong." But by morning, the clips were everywhere. Different angles, different voices. Same moment. A gun drawn too fast. A man who stayed calm. A situation that could have ended in tragedy, and didn't. Comment sections filled fast. Some angry, some relieved, some arguing about policy, training, authority. But one thing stayed consistent across every version of the story. No one could believe how calm Steven had been. News outlets picked it up next. Carefully worded headlines. Body cam stills blurred just enough to be objective. Analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, pointing out what went wrong. Too much adrenaline, too little assessment. A failure to slow down. Behind closed doors, the department moved faster than the public realized. Training schedules were revised. De-escalation modules were pulled forward. A mandatory review of firearm. Draw protocols was ordered, not announced loudly. Not celebrated. But done. The officer at the center of it all sat alone in a small interview room hours later, replaying the moment over and over in his head. Not the crowd, not the supervisors. The instant his finger had tightened, instead of loosened. The report would use careful language, escalation under stress. The footage would speak more clearly. Carriers don't always end with explosions. Sometimes they end quietly, with a door closing, a badge set down, and the realization that one decision can outweigh years of service. Steven didn't give interviews. He didn't post statements. When asked later why he stayed instead of walking away the moment the cuffs came off, his answer was simple: because walking away doesn't fix patterns. Those close to him understood what he meant. He'd spent decades training people in control. Not dominance, not intimidation, but restraint. The ability to pause when instinct screams to act. The discipline to choose the outcome you want, not the one your emotions demand. This wasn't about winning, it was about interrupting a cycle. Days later, a young officer, fresh out of the academy, watched the footage during a briefing. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen, when the gun appeared. His stomach tightened. When it was holstered again, he exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. After the session, he raised his hand. "Why didn't it turn out worse?" he asked. The instructor paused. "Because one person chose not to escalate," he said, and another person eventually listened. That answer stuck. Months from now, maybe years, no one would remember the exact date or the street name, but someone would remember that question when their own heart rate spiked. Someone would remember to breathe. That was the ripple effect. Steven returned to his routine, training, teaching. Quiet work that never made headlines, but occasionally someone would stop him. At an airport, outside a gym, in passing. "I saw that video," they'd say. "Thank you for staying calm. Thank you for not making it worse." He always gave the same response. "It's not about me." Because it never was. It was about the man who froze behind him, the woman who held her breath across the street, the officers who watched and learned. The next encounter that didn't happen the same way because of this one. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout commands or demand obedience. Real power is quiet, measured, deliberate. It knows when to step forward and when to stand still. Respect isn't earned by a badge or a title. It's earned in moments where you could choose force and choose restraint instead. That day, no one won. But everyone went home. And sometimes, that's the only victory that matters. If you believe calm is strength, not weakness. If you believe discipline matters more than ego. And if you believe every life deserves respect before judgment, then remember this story. Not for the celebrity, not for the uniform, but for the moment when everything could have gone wrong and didn't because someone chose control over chaos. And that choice changed everything.